I'm trying to simultaneously run the PowerPoint on two different screens. All right, so at the beginning of the 1600s, everybody in Europe wanted their own colonies in the New World. We talked a little bit about why. First of all, when Columbus discovered that there was this whole new place, this whole new land mass, that was interesting to Europe. When ships from Spain started to come back laden with gold, that was fascinating to Europe. But the fact of the matter is that the biggest reason why English powers really wanted to put their stamp on the New World is because if they didn't do so, they would pretty much fall behind their neighbors. The first thing that everybody was always looking for was this elusive Northwest Passage. There is still this idea that if you sail west and you get through this land that's in the way now, the New World, that on the other side of that, you'll be able to trade with India without going through that Islamic-held block on the eastern side of the Mediterranean without having to negotiate with the Ottoman Empire to get there, that you will be able to still trade with India, and that it'll be faster somehow to sail. But first you have to find a way through these land masses. Now this is the closest that the modern world has ever gotten to actually having a passage, a Northwest Passage, is that occasionally, a couple of times a year, it is possible to almost sail through the very, very tip of the Arctic Circle of North America by ships that were invented in the 1980s. They're able to navigate through what are basically unpredictable ice flows in order to get across the north. That's the closest we've ever actually gotten, with the exception of going through the Panama Canal, which is man-made and is, well, it's cumbersome and you have to go against the current to use it. So no matter which way they go, it is definitely not easier to go through America to get to India. But they keep hoping, and each country, as it gains the ability to do so, sends somebody to go and look for this passage. The Spanish continue to send people. They end up sending people to California. They end up sending people to Peru, and they end up sending people down to the south. The Portuguese have, by treaty, are allowed this whole area here. So they land in Brazil and they exploit the resources of Brazil, but then they go south and try to find a way around the South American Cape in order to get there, and they run into the ice from Antarctica when they do. So every country is trying. The second thing is that they find themselves with cash crops that they can, that these colonies can yield. These cash crops become incredibly valuable to Europe. Products that you can't grow in Europe are now growing in the New World and becoming incredibly popular in Europe. Some of them are really obvious, like beaver pelts. Suddenly, if you begin to study the art of this era, you see lots of pearls, lots of beaver pelts, and lots of indigo. And these are lots of this deep bluish purple cloth. And the reason for this is because these are the cash crops of the colonies. And if you have them, that must mean that you are attached somehow to those enterprises. And so you want to show that off. This is conspicuous consumerism to show off this wealth and your attachment to the New World. So suddenly we've got colonies being established specifically because of the access to beaver pelts, indigo. There's also land for breeding livestock. And there are some forms of animals that are in the New World that weren't in Europe. Certain breeds of pigs, for example. Y'all are from Southeast Arkansas or Southwest Arkansas and Northeast Texas, so you can imagine that there are wild pigs, you know. They find their way to the coastline and they begin to breed them and take them back as pork to Europe. Wheat, tobacco, just having the land to grow some of the things that they actually can grow in England, but they just don't have the land to do it. So cash crops become incredibly valuable. It's a good reason to have colonies. I want to just take a minute to explain, though, that the biggest division between the colonies is who founds them. So I want to take a second and let me just stop sharing for a minute here and explain how I'm going to cover the colonies. This week we're going to cover the royal colonies. Jamestown was the first of the royal colonies to be established, and it was established in 1607, arguably 1606, but we'll go with 1607. And it was established by royal charter by James I. The last of the colonies to be chartered by a monarch, by people who supported the monarchy, is Georgia, which is founded in, let me make sure I've got this right, 1733. Okay? So, can anybody guess which ones are the royal colonies? They're really easy to tell apart. A colony that's established in honor of a monarch usually has the monarch's name. So who would that be? Let's see, Virginia, royal colonies, Virginia. Well, that's part of the Virginia Company. Maryland is named after a monarch, and we'll cover that later. Delaware is not named after a monarch. Delaware is named in honor of an anti-monarchist, actually. No, Maine is not named after a king. Okay, so we've got Carolina, which is oddly named after Charles, because it used to be that when the king was named Charles, the French version of that is Carolingian, is a Carolingian monarch. So Carolina is named after Charles, and Georgia, which is named after George. Good. So those are the colonies that are named after monarchs and established by people who support the monarchy. Which ones are the ones that are not? How can you tell by their names that they're not? Give me the name of another colony. Yes?
New York.
New York. Not named after a royal, actually named after the Duke of York, who stood in opposition to the king.
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. Definitely not named after a monarch. What is Massachusetts named after? Does anybody know?
Isn't it something in Indian?
Yeah, it's named, this is actually the word that was given to it by the natives that lived there. So Massachusetts Bay is actually where they landed. What else?
New Hampshire?
New Hampshire, right? Which is named after the place where the settlers came from, which was Old Hampshire, just like New York. Yes?
Vermont.
Vermont, right? Also a native name. So you can tell by who establishes the colonies which ones were monarchy established and which ones were not. What are all of these colonies geographically? What do they have in common? What water? Specifically? Think Meteor, Peninsula, Chesapeake Bay. That's right, Chesapeake Bay colonies. Okay, arguably the Chesapeake Bay, although Georgia's a little further south of that. Okay, but they are all connected to the same part of the coastline. And that part of the coastline is in the south of the original 13 colonies. The non-monarchy colonies, we're missing a couple here, obviously, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. And yeah, Connecticut. So we're missing a couple of here, but these are all places that are named after either the place where they landed or the place where they started or the lord who was in charge of establishing them. And we're going to cover them all sort of separately. We have three basic arcs. We have the royal colonies, which go from 1607 to 1733. We have the Amsterdam colonies, which were stolen from the Dutch. Stolen. That's such a bad word. What do I mean? I don't mean stolen. They start in 1617 and go until 1644. And then we have the Puritan colonies. The Puritan colonies get started in 1620. And the last one is founded in 1680. Okay? This is a confusing graphic. Okay, so we've got different forces establishing colonies all at the same time. And they are formed depending on where they are, because most of these have in common is that they're centered around a different bay. They're centered around Massachusetts Bay. These are mostly centered around Chesapeake Bay. These are all established by and in honor of the monarchy. These are not. These are all in the south. These are all in the north. So right off the bat, we have a division between the northern and the southern colonies that starts really, really, really early. I hope y'all can see some of what we're talking about here, but I'll blow it up when I do the Zoom recording later.
Yes, ma'am, I can see it. But what is
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay,
Any other
good.
region?
Yeah, that's,
Is Maine one?
oh, you're right. I left Maine off even though you said Maine. Okay. All right. So Maine, yes. All of these are the northern colonies. These are the southern colonies. Not as far south as like Florida, but as far south as you can go before that. These are royalist monarchist colonies, and these are either established by the Dutch or established by the Puritans. So today we're not going to talk about the Puritan colonies much today, because we're going to talk about them a lot next week. So we'll get rid of all of the Puritan colonies. It's Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, and Vermont. We'll talk a little bit, and Rhode Island. And we'll talk a little bit about the Amsterdam colonies today. So let's go. Okay, Jamestown was the first of the royal colonies. I'm gonna go back to screen sharing here. Okay, Jamestown was the first of the royal colonies. It was established in 1607, and it would have been a disaster if it had not been brought under control by John Smith and Lord Delaware. They whipped the colonists into shape, and we talked about that quite a bit on Wednesday. If that colony had failed, there's a good chance that there would not be any more royal colonies, because the whole endeavor was based on the idea that this was supposed to be lucrative. The Spanish send these ships over and they establish colonies, and what do they come back with? Gold, lots and lots and lots of gold, silver, furs, feathers, all kinds of things. When England lands in North America, they don't find all of those things, so they got to find something else. The only reason that the New England colony of the Chesapeake Bay colony of Jamestown succeeded at all is because they managed to plant tobacco there and turn it into a cash crop colony. If it had not been for that, there's a good chance there would not have been a next royal colony. Yes?
Also, kind of a good thing they didn't start bringing back all kinds of gold, because didn't like Spain go into
Yes. You know what happens if you bring back shiploads full of gold into Europe? You know what happens to the value of gold? It plummets. Spain ends up one of the most impoverished countries as a result of their colonies, while England is thriving. And two reasons for that, really. England invests in the crop system, and also England steals their gold from them. So privateers. You know, and the Spanish only have one word for pirates at this time, and they're all this, it's just one word regardless of what their reason is. The English have freebooters, privateers, I don't know, there's like 7 different words for pirates, because it's not as bad as pirates. Anyway, so when the Netherlands get in, let's talk just for a second about those Amsterdam colonies. When the Netherlands get into colonizing, they send their explorer to find that eastern passage, that passage to the northwest, excuse me. And their explorer is Henry Hudson. Y'all have heard the name Hudson, right? The Hudson River pours into New York. They established Dutch settlements in 1613, and they are entirely focused on trade. They're not really establishing settlements with the plan of like having families grow up there and establishing new towns. They're basically just setting themselves up to be trading posts for the goods back to Europe. New Netherlands is the colonizing project that they actually start investing themselves in, because if you do have a lucrative trade post, it does turn into a town and eventually turns into a place that people want to go. So they do actually start to set up a colony, and that New Netherlands becomes New Amsterdam, which eventually will be taken over by the English. We'll get to that later. The Dutch West India Company was established specifically for the fur trade. It was beaver fur and beaver pelts and other animals that were up there in the Canadian, up in the Canadian waters. So a lot of the people that went to those colonies were kind of rough and tumble people. They weren't exactly the people that you would send if you wanted to be well represented, but they were good at their jobs. And as a result, the beaver trade in beavers through Amsterdam, through the Netherlands, became really, really rich in Europe. While this is going on, there is something important happening on the European continent, where, do y'all remember me talking about the church kind of falling apart because of the plague? Okay, so distrust in the church, distrust in the priests, distrust in the upper class by the lower class, all that kind of leads to this religious splintering. there are a couple of movements that get kicked off. One of them is led by a Catholic priest named Luther, and another is led by a Catholic lay minister who's also a lawyer named John Calvin. And their basic, say again? Oh, okay, you're just laughing. Okay, I thought I heard the Zoom voice. And then we have the movement by Henry VIII to establish its own separate church, which is Anglicanism. So you have these Protestant movements that are basically pulling the people apart. You have Elizabeth with her middle way, making it possible for people in England to practice any of these religions that happen to come up into their area. Now, John Calvin's people kind of went up into Scotland and skipped England. But some of his ideas, specifically his hatred of all of the ritual and pomp of the Catholic Church, managed to filter into English society quite a bit. Luther kind of spread mostly in this area, which becomes Germany later. But Germanic people who come into England also bring with them, you know, some of Luther's ideas as well. Martin Luther, yeah. The one with the nail in the door and the, yeah, all of that thing. Right. And we just had an anniversary of his, didn't we? Have like 500 years or something like that? Yeah, 500 years since the 95 Theses. Anyway, so these ideas are coming into England and becoming part of the practice of the Anglican Church. But all of the splintering happens, then you have to establish yourself as somebody with power in the government in England so that your beliefs can flourish. So in the English government, you've got people who are very hardcore anti-Catholics, and then you've got people who are Anglicans who kind of wish they were still Catholics. And all these people are jostling for power, and one of the ways that they gain power is by having a foothold in the New World. So the rise of Puritanism, which is purifying the church of everything Catholic. So get rid of the stained glass windows, get rid of the gold cross at the front of the church, get rid of the incense and the candles, get rid of everything that distracts from worship and actually make it just, you know, as boring as possible, the study of scripture, the study of your personal responsibilities in relationship to God, get rid of all of the hierarchy that goes up through bishops that aren't any holier than the people that they serve, just get rid of all of it. That's the Puritan movement. It's mostly Calvin that pushes the Puritan movement, but then after his time, after he ceases to be alive and his followers begin to do it, it becomes a much more rigid, punitive thing. And then these people, now I'm going to cover this, but this is a spoiler for next week. These people are going to come over to America in the full force of Puritanism. And then back in England, people are going to loosen up. But in America, they're not. So we'll talk about that next week. American Puritanism is much harsher than European Puritanism, partly because it got moved and cut off before it could continue to grow the way that it did in Europe. So if you're not from America and you ever wondered why Americans are the way they are about some things, about some topics, one of the reasons is because of that. We'll cover that more next week. The point is that people who believed in separating England from the Catholic Church and not having the Pope have power over them anymore really liked this movement because it also gave them, you know, power in the government. More and more members of Parliament are becoming Puritan, and then they're going to establish colonies, starting in 1620 with Plymouth Plantation, and then 1630 with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that's what we're going to cover next week. So let's talk about the royal family for a minute so that we can talk about the royal colonies. Now, we talked about King James. And this King James, I mean, he invested a lot in what he did when he was trying to leave his mark. Like Elizabeth before him and like Henry before her, he wanted to leave his mark on the religious world. That's why you have the King James Bible, is because he made sure that there was an English translation of the Bible available. He made every attempt to follow the successful things that Elizabeth had done and also to expand on them, which is why he had his own joint stock company, which is why he had a successful colony in the New World and she didn't. But he himself was just not very popular. Now, he had two sons, Henry and Charles, and Henry was raised to be king. He knew James knew that he was going to be king of England someday, and he knew that his son was going to take over for him. So he raised Henry to be the king. And Henry was probably going to be very good at it. If he had been allowed to be a king, he probably would have done a pretty good job. He'd been schooled in the middle way. He'd been schooled in how to navigate with the Puritans and the Catholics in government. He was ready. But he died. And then his daughter Elizabeth married, and she married across the water one of the German kings, and therefore gave up any hope of having a claim to the throne. So when James died, his younger son Charles took over. Now, like I said, James wasn't very popular, but I just want you to grasp the unpopularity of his son James. Any of y'all watch The Big Bang Theory? Do y'all watch that show at all? Okay, I just want you to imagine for a minute that because of a strange series of events, the next king of England was going to be Howard Wolowitz from The Big Bang Theory. Okay? Utterly, completely awkward, way too much. Whenever he did things, he did them too much. He was very extra and incredibly awkward, difficult to be around, difficult to take seriously, not very strong. He never thought he was going to be king. So, you know, he wasn't raised to do it. Just as an example, when Charles the First took the throne, he wasn't married. And the reason for that was because his father had gone to quite a bit of trouble to negotiate a marriage for him to a Spanish princess. And the Spanish princess had sent back a no thanks response to this arranged marriage. And just because he's special, Charles decided to sneak into the Spanish princess's palace in disguise as a big romantic gesture. He was about 16 at the time, and she was about 14. And he snuck into her palace with his best friend, Lord Buckingham, in disguise, and then scared the ever-living daylights out of her, and then said, "I'm here to marry you." And she basically went, "No, you're not. I promise you're not." She agreed that she would open negotiations with him if he would agree to become a Catholic. And he said, "That's crazy talk. I'm not going to become a Catholic just to marry you." And the way that he responded to her was so insulting. You get the impression, if you read the firsthand accounts, that he really thought that as soon as he showed up in her suite, in her literal, like practically in her bedroom, that she would swoon and be so happy to see him and fall madly in love. And the fact that she didn't was so insulting to him that he sulked and went back home. And also relations between England and Spain were slightly strained by this episode. A lot of the bad ideas he had were because of Lord Buckingham, his best friend. And Lord Buckingham eventually dies. So when he took the throne, he wasn't married. He liked all of the pomp of the Anglican services. You know, his brother had been raised to respect the middle way. Don't go too overboard on your own personal religious beliefs. Make sure that you leave space for everybody to, feel like you're not going to come after them with a flaming torch if they practice the wrong way. He didn't get trained that way. He was allowed to kind of just choose what he liked. So he likes the candles. He likes the stained glass, the gold, all of the things about the Catholic Church. He likes all those things. He wants to be Anglican, the head of the church, but he likes all those Catholic things so much that his parliamentary government gets a little worried about how much he likes the Catholic Church, like he's going to bring them back under the Pope's control. And then almost immediately after he takes the throne, he marries a French princess who is very, very, very Catholic. So just to be sure that he's not going to get too much power, Parliament begins to clamp down on his ruling ability. More Puritan members join the Parliament, they take power, they make alliances, they group up in defense against this king who's going to make them Catholic again against their will. So Charles makes a couple of decisions that worry them quite a bit. One of them is that at one point, he makes a promise to his father-in-law, the French princess's father, that when this land war that's happening between the French and the Holy Roman Empire, between the Germans, over religion, that he will lend troops to that. He will send his army in to help the French defeat all of their enemies. And the Parliament doesn't want to do it because they don't want to get into the middle of this land war. So they agree instead to attack Spanish settlements, not to attack the Holy Roman Empire on European land, but to attack Spanish settlements in the New World instead. And Charles is mad about that and throws a big fit and dissolves Parliament. Tells them all to go home. 1629. And for a little while he rules without Parliament's help. But you know, one of the things that he does is he allows the founding of a new colony by Lord Baltimore, who was a Catholic who was harassed under Queen Elizabeth. And this is supposed to be a colony in America where Catholics can go and safely live and not be harassed. So he founds that on his own while Parliament is dissolved. So that's a decision he makes without their help. They name the Parliament they name Maryland after his wife, Henrietta Marie, the French princess. And it is supposed to be a haven for Catholics. But if you see where it's positioned, where's the Chesapeake Bay? Is right here. Woo. The Chesapeake Bay is right here. Here is, Jamestown is down here. Up here is Maryland. And right on the edge here is actually a Puritan colony that gets established. So everybody is always fighting over all of these waterways. Up here is a Puritan colony. And access to the bay and getting out into the ocean is something that these ports all guard really jealously, and they don't like the Catholics anyway. So they get into a fight, a border dispute, over Kent Island. You have to zoom in pretty close to find this island. It's right here. I mean, I put a circle around it so I could find it, but you would think it was a nothing thing, but because it guards the entrance to the Atlantic Ocean, and it's the coastal access for both Maryland colonies, the Catholic colonies, and the Puritan colonies on the other side, they get into a pretty vicious fight over it. So in Europe, you've got the Puritans facing off against the Catholics on land, and in the American colonies, you've got them facing off over Kent Island. It's like a miniature version of what's happening over in Europe. So they get into a fight. He doesn't have anything in particular that he can do about it, King Charles. They're getting into fights throughout the 1630s. Charles, for some reason, is not very good at making peace with his enemies or making truces with his allies. Where he goes into a situation, he seems to make it worse. He gets into fights with all kinds of foreign powers. At one point, he is both supported by and hated by the Scots at the same time. And whenever he gets into a war, he always threatens to go full into that war. I'm coming after you with everything I've got. The problem is that the power to actually tax the public and finance wars is in the hands of Parliament. The king can't do that. He can't order new taxes to support war. So he's dissolved the Parliament, but he needs them to come back and approve new taxes so he can have war. So in 1640, he brings Parliament back, and they agree to come back on the condition that he let them control the military. And he says no and dissolves them again. He fires them all again. They call that proroguing. He prorogues the conference. He ends Parliament and he sends them all home again. And they're like, okay, that's it. We got to get rid of him. So actual, honest to God, civil war breaks out in England between the people who support the king and his endeavors and the people who don't, who support the Puritans and their endeavors. I just wanted you to take a look at this picture. The war between the monarchists, the royalists, and the Puritans they were affectionately called the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. They were called Roundheads because Puritans cut their hair like with a bowl, you know, like a bowl cut. They cut it short and they kept it short, and then they wore these little helmets on top of them so that they were round-headed. And then the Cavaliers were like the Musketeers. They had their, you know, they took a lot of pride in their long flowing locks and their big hats with feathers and poofs in their sleeves. So I want you to take a look at this picture. This picture is from the English Civil War, the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. You can see the little helmet he's got on top of his head there. You can see it. This picture is from the American Civil War, almost 210 years later. Notice any similarities? What do you see? Okay, the position of the horse rearing up there. Look at the man on the horse in each one of these pictures. What similarities do you see between these two people? They're fabulous hats, right? They have their fabulous hat. They've got a feather. They've got the long beard, the long hair. Yeah, there's that blue uniform that's very fancy.
And you have officer swords.
Right, they're both wielding swords as officers.
So you could also say that like the horse on the sword is similar.
Yeah, so it's almost the same vibe. It almost has like the same, and the reason for that is because the forces that established these royal colonies were cavaliers. And they formed them during the time of the English Civil War. The ones who formed the northern colonies were formed by the Roundheads, and they were formed during the time of the English Civil War. So you can draw those similarities 210 years later when these two go to civil war against each other. You can already draw similarities between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. It's almost as though, and this is just almost as though, the American Civil War is in part a continuation of the English Civil War. Like it never really got settled. And so they fought it out on American territory too. You could almost say that. Either way, those differences exist like pretty much right away. And they persist for hundreds of years after that. As a matter of fact, an argument could be made that they still exist now. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so Cavaliers and Roundheads. The Civil War goes on for some time. It goes from about 1640 to about 1649. At the end of the war, what ends the war really is that Charles I is arrested and put in jail and then put on trial. And at his trial, it is established that he is, because he rallied the people in various places, in foreign places, to come in and defeat his enemies on his own ground. So because he rallied the Scots and the French to come in and fight on his behalf against the Puritan Englishmen, that he had in fact committed treason, which is historically pretty remarkable to have a king tried and convicted of treason. That almost never happens, because anything the king does, he does in his own country, right? How can it be treason? He's the king. But that's actually what they do. They rule that he committed treason and they have him beheaded. So that's the end of Charles Wolowitz's reign, is that he is beheaded. And the people that take over are those high-powered parliamentarian politicians, specifically the Cromwells, Oliver and his son. They won't bring in themselves as a new king, and they absolutely are against the idea of kings. They really don't want England to have a king anymore. They think England should be done with kings. But just to be on the safe side for a little while, their plan is to rule as Lord Protectors. And as Lord Protectors, they're going to have some pomp and some ceremony, and they're going to make laws, and they're going to have the final say in anything politics, anything that happens in Parliament, and you will do as they say because they command the military. So what is the difference between the Lord Protectors and the kings, really, when it comes down to it? Yes?
Oliver Cromwell didn't want his job.
That's true, actually. Oliver Cromwell was never intended to be king, but once he was there, he clamped down pretty hard. One of the things that they did was in the same year that Charles I was beheaded, they instituted what was called the Act of Toleration in Maryland. And the point of this was to create a place of freedom of religion. Now, they didn't do it. The colonists did it. The Maryland colonists did it. But they did it in response to the fact that Charles I was being beheaded. They wanted to protect their own rights. So what they did was they created this act, which sounds really nice, the Act of Religious Toleration, but it's really not, because you have to meet certain requirements in order to be tolerated under this act. You have to acknowledge the Trinity, so Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You have to, you can be sentenced to death for not believing in Jesus.
Is this when they started doing the Quakers?
Say what?
Is this when the Quakers started?
No, the Quakers really come down from the Dutch. So, and it doesn't apply somehow to the Catholics. So even in the Catholic colony of Maryland, they still expect you not to be Catholic. So it's repealed in 1654 by the Cromwells, and then reinstated in 1657, and then Catholicism gets outlawed completely in the 1690s. So there's never really a good time to be a Catholic in the New World. So the Cromwells, Oliver and his son Richard, were called King Oliver and King Dick by their people. They outlawed all Catholic practices in English churches everywhere. They were themselves strong Puritans, so they get rid of all Catholic practices. And then they divided England up into military districts and imposed rule over those districts using the military on their own people. And one of the things the Cromwells did that cost them quite a bit was that they allowed for British ships to seize, like privateers, to seize Dutch ships. Now the Dutch had helped defeat the Spanish Armada. The English couldn't have done it without them. So the Dutch are pretty upset about this. So the Dutch declare war on the English, which is okay because that allows for the Dutch to be overthrown by the English and their colonies to be taken over in the New World by the English. So the Dutch declare war on England and lose, and as a result, England gets the Dutch colonies in America. In 1660, monarchists, people who supported the crown, are managed to finally put together a big enough force to overthrow Cromwell's people. It's not as hard as it would have been 10 years before because people have gotten tired of the military discipline. They've been tired of being divided into military districts. So it's easier to find support for putting a king back on the throne. So they do. The son of Charles, Charles II, is crowned, and he is fabulous in all his glory. Every bit as awkward as his father, but way more fashion forward. And in 1660, when he takes the crown, one of the first things he does is charter a new colony, because that's how you prove that you're a good king. You charter a colony and it thrives. That's how James did it, and that's how Charles did it with Maryland, and now he's going to do it. So he charters a colony and basically names it after his father, but really it's also kind of named after himself, and that's Carolina. And then he gives that colony as a reward to all the nobles who helped him take the throne back. So in 1687, he gives another charter to a colony to a man named William Penn, who he basically owed a lot of money to. And Penn establishes an anti-monarchical colony called Pennsylvania. That's why it's not counted as a royal colony, because Penn didn't support the crown. They just owed him a lot of money. And they settled their debt by giving him a colony. Okay. Charles II is actually who leads the fight to take the Dutch colonies after they've declared war on England. He's the one who actually leads the fight to take the colonies away from them. So the New Netherlands colonies surrender to the English colonies. They don't surrender to the English crown. They surrender to their neighbors to the south. And New Amsterdam becomes New York in honor of Charles II's brother, the Duke of York. And New Jersey splits off in New York and becomes a separate colony. Okay, so somewhere in the middle of this, Charles II offends people again, and people begin to question the lineage. Now, I don't know how well you can actually see this chart, but I want you to remember that James I had 3 children: Henry, who died, Elizabeth, who went off and got married to somebody on German soil, and then Charles, who was beheaded. Charles had several children. Charles had Charles II. He had Henry Philippe. He had Mary, and he had Anne, and then he had James II. So the crown gets passed from person to person to person. And in 1688, there's a popular uprising against the crown, and the population overthrows James II and then replaces him with somebody from the other side of the water, with the child of this one who's married to the grandchild of this one. And you end up with King William and Princess Mary in charge of England. You don't need to know any of that in order to follow the colonies. All you need to know is that what's happening in England is like a juggling thing with the crown. And over the course of about 50 years, the crown gets passed from person to person to person to person and ends up in the hands of George. Okay, George I, who is the grandchild of James's daughter, who got married to the German guy. Okay? When the crown gets handed over to somebody on the other side of the family tree, they have to establish themselves as a real crown. They have to establish themselves as a real piece of royalty. How do they do it? How have they done it all along? How do you prove that you're supposed to be in charge of a country? That you have God's blessing to be in charge of a country? Yeah, you build another colony. So George charters a colony, and that colony is founded by somebody whose belief is that There we go. The belief of the person who founds that colony is Oglethorpe, and he believes that debt collection in England has gotten too harsh. And so he establishes it as a place where debtors can go and work off their debt on these plantations that do not actually have slaves, because in all of the other Chesapeake colonies, slavery is really taking off. Slavery is how most of the work gets done. And he wants to establish a colony, and the colony is Georgia, where slavery is prohibited. He wants to prove it can be done. So he has debtors come there and work off their sentences. And because they're debtors, because they're people who've managed to get themselves in trouble before, he establishes a very strict colony, no slaves, no liquor, and no selling or buying of land. Everything needs to be handled through the government of Georgia. And the colony almost falls apart, goes completely bankrupt. So he lifts all of the, he doesn't lift it, the people that come after him lift all of those restrictions, and it thrives. Georgia becomes the place with the most slaves, that brews the most liquor, and becomes one of the places that really thrives. But when it starts out, that's not what it is. So those are all of the royal colonies. And here's the Chesapeake Bay. Let's see, can I do this ambidextrously? Yes, I can. Okay, so here's the Chesapeake Bay. And I said that Georgia was on the Chesapeake Bay, and it is, but only because the rivers that flow, you know, because the path of trading goes up in there. Mostly it's centered on Georgia or Virginia and Maryland. But these are all referred to as the Chesapeake Bay colonies. These are the southern colonies. Next week, we're going to talk about the northern colonies and how they get established. So a little bit about the southern colonies. What gets established in these colonies is very much an aristocratic system. They're established by people who are faithful to the royalist idea, which means that this whole idea of this triangle is something that they value. Okay? The idea that at the top of this is the king, and then everybody else sort of fits under this. So we don't have, we have dukes that take land in the Americas, but what are they actually, practically what do they become when they get to America? Who are the dukes in the southern colonies? Who are the noblemen?
Plantation owners.
Plantation owners, that's right. So in England, they're kings and then nobles and then peasants. Or, well, there's a class in between. Craftsmen.
Is this why the cotillion is really big in the South?
What do you think?
Yeah.
And then workers, peasants,
You never heard of the cotillion?
right? Okay, so this is the way this works in England. The king, and then the nobles who own the land, and then the merchants who deal with the nobles and provide them with the things they need that they can't grow. And then underneath that is a class of workers and peasants, non-land owning people. There are all different kinds of division of nobles. There's little nobles and big nobles. So they have their own hierarchy. In the American colonies, these are plantation owners. These are skilled craftsmen. And these are tenants and slaves. Okay? So it's exactly across the board, a transplantation of the exact same feudal system right into the colonies. Okay, that's a definitive characteristic of the southern colonies. They have, their bureaucracy is almost entirely controlled by the church. Remember in England, who's at the head of the church? The king. And the bishops are another form of noble. So they do the same thing in the southern colonies. The person who is the governor of your colony is probably also the head of your church. The people with real pull and say in your community are probably the elders of your church. And they don't have to be good church-going people in order to hold a position in the church. The reason they hold position in the church is because they own land and they're plantation owners, just like the bishops and the nobles. They don't have to actually be real. They just have to be in power. So that's something that's also transplanted to the South. Their lifestyle is almost entirely centered on their agriculture. And as a result of this system, because the plantation owners are seen to be the cream of the crop, who can school the children of the plantation owners? Who can provide them with their education the best? The plantation owners, right. So people's education happens inside their own family. They hire tutors sometimes, but education is the responsibility of the family. And one big thing about the Southern colonies is, by definition, they are all about their social drinking. They are a drunk people. You might find something a little bit different if you go over the fall line. On the other side of the fall line, you find hardworking people who have worked off their indenturehood. We're going to talk about them a lot more later in the semester. But I want you to have a really good, solid understanding of these royal colonies. Okay,